Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. Every week, we bring you the stories of people who are working to make the world better in some small way. We bring stories of those who see service as an opportunity to kind of tap into the very best parts of themselves. This allows us to talk to people all over the world. We are an online and asynchronous club, part of Rotary International, over 1 million Rotarians and Rotaractors in 36,000 clubs around the planet. And the opportunity to share these stories with you is something that we take very seriously. So you might check out our YouTube channel and the many recordings that we have there that are designed to inspire you to see all sorts of positive where you might need in a world where there's all kinds of bad news all the time. Our speaker today is a professor at Stanford University. He is part of both the engineering department and the computer science department. He is also a former lead at Google. He has been involved in computer science education and standards used globally, all kinds of cool things. For the full bio, pause the YouTube video and scroll down a little bit on the page where the comments are, or on our siliconvalleyrotary.com page, pause and scroll back up and see all of the cool information that we have there about his awards and position and publications and such. Mehran, we are excited to have you here talking about this topic of ethics in AI, and we welcome you to the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. I hand the microphone over to you.
Thanks very much, Rushton. It's a pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon, or whatever time it is in your locale. What I would like to do is spend a little bit of time talking about a book that some colleagues and I wrote a couple of years ago now, which probably is actually even more relevant today, given with the revolution that we're seeing in artificial intelligence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a little screen with you and take you through the story of this book a little bit. It's called System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. And the colleagues that I wrote this with are Rob Reich, who is a moral philosopher and political philosopher in the political science department at Stanford University. Jeremy Weinstein, who is also a professor of political science at Stanford and was a staffer in the Obama White House, so has a lot of public policy experience. And then I, as the computer scientist, we came together a few years ago to think about the trends that were happening in technology, the impacts that they were happening in the world, and understanding that there's actually lots of value trade-offs when we think about impacts of technology and the kinds of results that we would like to see. And so we think about it from the standpoint of philosophically, what are the value trade-offs? What does the technology enable? What are the kinds of policies we might want to see around it? Which is why we look at these problems through these different lenses and why the three of us came together to write this book. The book was actually based on a class we've been teaching at Stanford for about 6 years now. And we've had, at this point, a couple thousand students go through it. And so one of the things that we think about, what we want students to understand, is that when we think about technologies, there are certain externalities, to use the language of economists, that are generated. These externalities or impacts that technology has on society that then are borne by society in terms of the negative impacts that they need to deal with. And so I have this picture here. It's the same way we might think about, say, air pollution that's generated by the burning of fossil fuels. These days, there are more regulations around that, but there was a time in which the fossil fuel industry could actually get the benefits of, for example, distilling petroleum into gasoline and then pollute the environment. Society had to bear the brunt of the pollution, but they got the benefits. The industry got the benefits. And so what we're seeing is effects happening in technology now where there are substantial benefits of technology. We're not Luddites. We don't believe that we need to stop the progress of technology, but we need to better understand its externalities, ways that we can control them, and the impacts that they have on society. So part of understanding these externalities is also understanding what are the causes of these kinds of effects in technology. Congress likes to bring the CEOs of various companies out for various hearings because that's how they view themselves as, doing something about technology. What these hearings oftentimes reveal is just how little lawmakers actually know about some of the technologies. They're getting better at it, but, some of the technology hearings have not been particularly revealing. And more importantly, understanding that this is not a story about individuals that are running the companies. This is about certain kind of systemic effects that take place no matter who is running these companies. And that's something we try to unpack in our book. So to talk about the systemic effects, what are the drivers of some of these effects that we see in technology? One of them is what we refer to as the optimization mindset of technologists. The idea here that as engineers, and I count myself as one of these folks, we are trained to be able to think of problems as optimization problems. There is basically some objective, something that we want to achieve or something that we want to maximize, and we figure out ways to make that as good as possible. Now, the interesting thing is when you apply this to technology, there's problems that come up with the optimization mindset. So, for example, say you're Facebook or Meta, your stated mission might be to connect the world. Well, what does it mean to connect the world? In terms of the things you can actually measure about connecting the world, you might look at the number of people on your platform, the amount of time they spend on the platform, the amount of content they interact with, how much stuff they click on. Those, in some sense, are proxies for connecting the world. But then, when you understand, for example, that people click on information that's inflammatory, that might be titillating, just the number of clicks or how long they spend on the platform is not a measure necessarily of connecting people. And so, the proxies you have for the things you optimize are actually poor proxies for what's really happening in the world. And so, you might get effects that happen like polarization or people getting more upset or depressed based on spending more time online because they're seeing content that's actually making them feel bad. So those are things that, unless they're actually measured and part of the objective, which oftentimes they are not part of the objective, if you're just trying to sell more ads or get more time on the platform, that are external effects that are felt by society, that are felt by the users of the technology, or even just society writ large. For example, impact on our elections with misinformation and disinformation, but they are not necessarily the things for which the companies themselves are penalized for. They get the benefits of selling more ads or having more time on their platform. Now, along with the optimization mindset also comes the notion of who gets to choose what kinds of things get optimized. These days, it's a small group of executives at these companies. We don't have a lot of democratic process in determining what are the objectives that should actually try to be optimized. And so we don't have much say then into what are the value trade-offs as to what that objective should be. Part of the reason for that is that there's a regulatory oasis in some sense around many tech companies. If you remember back in the mid 1990s, Al Gore said he invented the internet. Some people find that phrase a little bit humorous, but in fact, what the Clinton Gore administration was responsible for was basically creating a regulatory oasis around technology to limit liability and to allow for more commercial traffic on the internet as a way to use the internet as a platform for invigorating commerce and the economy. And in fact, back in the mid 1990s, when we got policies like the Communications Decency Act, they were probably the right policy at the right time to create this sort of economic prosperity on the internet. The problem is that now it's 30 years later and we're in the same regulatory regime, even though the world is very different. And so we might want to think about more sort of regulatory guardrails that are necessary in order to still harness the benefits of technology while trying to mitigate some of the downsides, which in the past 30 years have become much more painfully evident. What are some of those downsides? Some of the particular topics we highlight in the book include things like algorithmic bias and fairness. As some people know these days, many consequential decisions in your life are now being made by algorithms or by computers. Questions of things like who gets access to credit, who gets access to a mortgage, who gets access to particular kinds of healthcare, and what sorts of therapies are approved for what groups of people. Even issues in the criminal justice system. Who gets bail, for example, should they come before a judge in the criminal justice system? Many of these decisions now, which are heavily consequential in our lives, are being made by algorithms. And it brings up questions of fairness because people who've studied these issues find that the kinds of decisions that are being made show biases by gender and by race, by other attributes. And if that's the case, we need to have some sort of guardrails in place to basically ensure levels of fairness and mitigate bias across the deployment of these algorithms. For example, requiring things like audits. So if an algorithm is going to be deployed, before it's deployed, it's measured for these kind of biases and attempts are made to mitigate the bias. And if they can't be sufficiently mitigated, then the algorithm can't be deployed. There's a great example of this. Amazon.com, a few years ago, they get a huge volume of resumes to screen, built an automated system to screen resumes to help determine who should get interviews. What they found upon auditing that system was that it showed bias against women in very subtle ways. So, for example, if your resume had the word softball on it, like you were on a softball team versus a baseball team, which is gendered in terms of who tends to be on those teams, you would get discriminated against by the algorithm simply because the data it was trained on had a preponderance of male applicants or males who had been previously hired into technical positions versus women. Now, much to Amazon's credit, they discovered this. They tried to fix it. They're one of the most technologically sophisticated companies on the planet. They could not get the bias out of the system, and they decided to shut it down. So that was actually a case where the right thing happened. They analyzed the algorithm, they tried to fix it, and they realized if you can't fix it, you shouldn't use it. But you need to understand they were not legally required to do that. Well, fully. There are some caveats. We could talk about that. But it brings up the question of how many systems are deployed that makes these kinds of consequential decisions in our lives that are not audited because this is not required in the current regulatory structure, at least in a number of different domains. Another issue we talk about is the notion of data maximization or privacy. The fact that when you're spending time online, you're clicking on content, you're looking at web pages, you're buying products, there's a large volume of data that's being gathered about you. And that data is being used to make inferences about what you might be interested, what you might want to buy, what you might want to see. Now, this is one of the things that powers a lot of internet advertising and actually makes these companies very profitable so that they can give you free services. But the question is, how much privacy are you giving up for that? What sorts of things can now be inferred about you that you might actually find problematic? And so, one of the ways we think about privacy is what information about yourself do you want to ensure so that you can have autonomy in the world? Some people argue, why should I even worry about privacy? Why is it a concern? And so this is one of the issues we posit to our students. We say, imagine everything you said, everything you did, all the sites you visited online, your physical location was available as a continuous stream on the internet. So people could get all that information and see it. Would it change what your activities were? Would it change your decisions? Would it change what you said? Was it change what kinds of things you did? If it would have an impact on you, which for most people it would, if everything about them was transparent, that means that your privacy is very important to your personal autonomy. It is important to you as an individual to make choices about your life that are meaningful. So if you don't have privacy, you don't have complete autonomy. And so that privacy has real value. And understanding that value and how you want to protect it has to be an issue that needs to be grappled with, potentially from a regulatory regime to think about how we do that. And Europe is actually sort of further ahead of the United States in these frameworks. Another issue we talk about, and this has certainly gotten a lot of press recently in the past year and a half, as generative AI models like ChatGPT have become more available to consumers, is the amount of automation, the amount of artificial intelligence that's basically being built, and how that will impact things like human well being, human prosperity, and job displacement. Now, clearly, there's going to be impacts on the job market from generative AI, and those impacts are not going to be uniform across all markets. Some markets, some sectors, some labor sectors will definitely be impacted more than others. And there are questions about the extent to which jobs will be augmented versus being displaced. And one of the questions we often get asked is, so how much unemployment is going to happen as a result of AI? How many jobs is AI going to displace? And one of the responses we have is AI is going to provide a technology that potentially could make people more productive or could automate certain jobs away. But the decision about that automation, how it gets used and what jobs get replaced, is still a human decision. So we have a lot of agency in that. And we need to understand if these things are going to happen, how do we prepare for it? Because the writing's on the wall. There are going to be disruptions in the labor market. The question is, how do we think about policies for reskilling, for job retraining, to be able to get people who are going to be in the sectors that are most impacted by those technologies to have new skills to be able to move into other kinds of positions? So these aren't impossible problems. They're just the kinds of things we need to plan for when we understand what's on the horizon. One of the final topics we talk about in the book, which is also an issue that is certainly on people's minds in election years, so this happens to be an election year, 2024, is thinking about the notions of free speech and the impact of the information that's available online on our democracy. As we saw in the 2016 election, and there was also signs of this in Brexit in the 2020 election, there is misinformation and disinformation, which is the intentional misinformation being placed online to try to influence people's opinions, for example, in things like elections. How do we trade that off with the notion of free speech? We want to have free speech, which allows people to say lots of things, including things that are potentially false online. Many of those things are guaranteed by the First Amendment. But we also need to understand that that has an impact on our democracy when people put out information that is intentionally false to try to sway voter opinion around issues by giving them information that is not actually true. So, how do we trade those things off? What are the value trade offs? And who gets to make these decisions? Right now, it's in small number of executives at these large platforms that get to make that decision. Is there a way to be able to make this a more democratic process, or to have particular kinds of guardrails or even liability for these companies so that we can ensure that more of the information that we're getting is actually truthful and we get it in a way that exposes us to different points of view? So when I talk about all this, sometimes people get very pessimistic and say, well, there's all these problems with technology. What do we do about it? And the way we like to think about it is it doesn't have to be this way. Technology is not just a wave that washes over us. It is something that we have control over and we have some agency. Now, at a personal level, we think about issues like, what can you do? Well, there's certain things you can control yourself. You can set the privacy settings in your applications, for example, to limit what information about you is collected and tracked. There's privacy settings you can set in your web browser for when you're browsing online. There's various kinds of plugins or things like incognito mode to keep your search history private if you don't want people to know what kinds of things you're looking at. Many websites that you go to now ask about your cookie preferences. Oftentimes people ignore these, but they're actually worthwhile to think about what information is being tracked. And you can thank the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which actually came out of the European Union. But now we're seeing some movement like the California Consumer Privacy Act in California, that is trying to provide similar sorts of safeguards. But we don't yet have federal legislation for privacy in the United States, something that we're behind the ball on, we should be thinking about. But one of the things to also keep in mind is that individual action is insufficient to solve this problem. And the reason for that is, think about Facebook. I can go into Facebook and set all my individual preferences for privacy, but I'm not inoculated to the effects of Facebook on our democracy simply because I choose to set my privacy settings. Or in the extreme case, I choose to delete the application, which is what many of these providers say, right? This is a choice question. If you don't like the application, just don't use it. It's not a big deal. But if it has impacts on our society that happen whether or not I use the application, it shows you that the argument around it's simply a matter of choice, and if you don't like it, don't use it, is really a red herring argument. It doesn't really fully solve the problem. What we really need are systemic solutions. And the way we think about this is sort of an analogy with the roadway system. So back in the turn of the 20th century, going from the 19th to the 20th century, when cars were starting to be mass produced, there was actually lots of accidents on the road and lots of people got killed and many people got hurt. And so what happened as a result? We didn't say your choice was just drive or not drive. We said what we're going to do is we're going to build a system of safety for everyone around driving. We're going to tell you what side of the road you should drive on. We're going to put speed bumps around schools and create speed limits in areas where you need to slow down. We're going to have stop signs. We're going to have traffic lights. We're going to have you wear a seatbelt. So if you get into an accident, you have less damage to yourself as a person. So we create a whole system of safety, basically guardrails through regulation around driving. Now you still have a choice to drive or not. There's still lots of innovation in how cars are produced. We can have electric cars, cars based on gasoline, lots of different modes of transportation. So it hasn't stopped innovation, but it's just made driving safer for everyone. That's the argument we make around things like the internet and technology. There's lots of regulations you can have that don't stifle innovation at all, that make the system safer for everyone. And that's where we need to get to, because right now we don't have much regulatory structure around some of these issues. One of the things we try to instill in our students, being educators at Stanford, is to think about having an ethic of responsibility in computer science. In the extreme case, you could actually even think of legal sanctions. So, for example, in the medical domain or in the legal domain, you can actually lose your license if you engage in malpractice. That's kind of the extreme case. But we like to think of trying to build a notion of ethical responsibility in the same way that many other domains like medicine have into the computing domain. Now, when we think about moving beyond that to regulatory solutions, we need to think about what are the ways in which we check the power of large companies, right? It's many of these large companies, and I say this as a former Googler myself. I actually worked for many years at Google before I went back to academia. that how do we think about processes in which there is more public say and democratic process in the decisions that get made with respect to what information we get, what safeguards are available to us, how we have a safer system for technology for everyone. And in order to have that, just to wrap up, what we really need is to build a democracy capable of governing technology. We need to not just have shows where CEOs of companies get pulled into hearings in Congress and there's some discussion and nothing happens. What we need to do is enable a government that actually has the expertise to think about technology policy. And if this sounds impossible to you, it shouldn't be. This is something we actually had back in the 80s and 90s. We had something called the OTA, the Office of Technology Assessment, which was a nonpartisan organization that basically informed Congress about technology so they could make more informed technology decisions. That office actually got disbanded in the 90s with the Contract for America. There's really no reason why we couldn't bring it back other than regulatory will. So that's something that we as citizens need to demand. We need to demand that our government build its own capability to be able to deal with technology problems so that it's not simply beholden to lobbyists at companies to make these decisions or to provide the guidance, but it has its own technical expertise to try to break some of the gridlock around getting technology policy. So with that, I will stop sharing and we will turn it back to you, Rushton, for discussion.
Good deal. Well, as we start into the questions, first of all, I want to introduce the people on the call. We have from our club here in the Bay Area, Sandy. Sandy, thank you for joining us. From Houston, Texas, Rory Olson. Rory, good to see you. My name is Rushton Hurley. I am in San Jose, California, and I'll get the question started. When we talk about regulation, one of the challenges that we face is that the speed of development is such that the already difficult plan of understanding a certain level of complexity is now falling behind the light speed development of the technologies themselves. So the analogy with the road system, I'm imagining if within the space of a couple of years we went from cars to to hypersonic vehicles, right? I mean, that's what it feels like with generative AI. Does it cause us to look at regulation in different ways in terms of how it comes together as a function of the speed of the development of the technology?
That's a great question. And it is one of the questions that people wonder about, is it even possible to regulate the technology because it's moving so quickly? And I think the answer is yes, we can. The way we need to think about it is not just regulating a particular piece of technology, but understanding what the risks would be in particular domains, and then having policies that actually refer to the technology's ability to generate greater risk. So, for example, if we think about the medical domain, we could think about, okay, what are some of the risks we might have there? What kinds of requirements do you want to have, say, for a human in the loop for life critical decisions that are made by technology? So that kind of requirement can exist no matter how advanced the technology is. And over time, we might revisit it and refine it depending on how effective we see the technology is. But what it does is it divorces the notion of what are the particulars of the technology that's being developed from what its impact is. And so if we focus on ways to think about what are the impacts we want to achieve and what are the things, for example, we need to test, audit, require human in the loop for those different kind of impacts, that gives us a kind of policy that has a longer lifespan to it than just trying to regulate the particular details of a piece of technology itself.
Thinking about how regulatory systems work, is it the case that the the instantly global nature of these kinds of technologies means that we are, in a sense, democratizing the response by having people in the EU approach this in one way, in North America another, in China a third? I mean, is there something about the speed of the technology that means that we are now learning from each other with regard to possibilities of regulation in a way that's especially constructive for how we see the possibilities with government response?
There's absolutely possibilities there. And one way you see it is the fact, if you look at the example of privacy, the fact that the General Data Protection Regulation came out in the EU prompted more people in the United States to think about it. And there are many similarities between that policy and the California Consumer Privacy Act. And that's not a coincidence. That was used as one model for it. Now, one of the things that's interesting, though, is that you see in regulation, there are high-level principles that people do care about that might have to do with, say, the rights that particular individuals have or the harms that we might want to mitigate. But the way we might go about doing the actual regulation will vary based on some of the outcomes we want to see in that locale. And I'll give you one example to make this concrete. I was having a conversation with a lawmaker from the EU a while back about GDPR versus CCPA. And one of the questions that always comes up is, well, Europe tends to regulate, the United States innovate. So if we have regulation, isn't that going to stifle, or if we have regulation, won't that stifle innovation? And so if you look at the California Consumer Privacy Act, one of the things you actually see is there's carve-outs for small companies. And so small companies defined by number of users, market cap of the company, a few other things, revenue. But basically what it says is if you're below these thresholds, this regulation doesn't apply to you. So it gives you space to be able to innovate as a small company. But it says, look, this is what the future looks like. And all small companies want to become large companies generally. So what it says is, if you're going to become a large company, these are the regulations you need to abide by so you can begin to plan early and know what that roadmap looks like. So there's no surprise down the road when you get to a particular size. Now, the interesting thing about GDPR is it doesn't have those carve-outs. And so when I was having this discussion with this lawmaker, his take was, well, we based our framework on human rights, and there's no carve-out for human rights. And I think the interesting thing from the standpoint of CCPA is it's based on a harms-based framework. It basically says the amount of harm you can have on privacy is much smaller if you affect smaller numbers of people or in some smaller way. But if you have the potential for greater harm, then that's where more of the regulation kicks in. And so this is a value trade-off between having the space for innovation at a small level versus thinking about what level of harms are acceptable. Those are the kinds of things that are value trade-offs for a particular country or locale to determine for themselves. But it still brings up the larger picture that something is necessary to put these kinds of safeguards for things like privacy in place.
Well, I love the fascinating nuance within that. Thank you. Speaking of externalities, I'd like to talk about the effect on education that a lot of these technologies have had. So certainly with cell phone technology, with social media, there's been an effect that many people understand, but you'd have to be within the fold probably to truly understand the tumult caused by generative AI. I'm an educator who believes that at least at the moment, the benefits outweigh the costs in terms of the headaches. But in that you and your fellow authors have been teaching this particular course at Stanford, I'm interested in what kinds of things you have seen from the students in thinking about responses to different topics that you bring up in the course, that they are bringing with perhaps a very fresh perspective on what the technologies might be and can do, and how your experience as an educator talking about technologies has allowed you to understand possibilities in the technologies you might not have otherwise.
Right. So one of the things, generative AI is a great example of externalities, right? Some company like OpenAI releases ChatGPT. Lots of students now have the opportunity to have them help or actually generate a whole essay for them. So it creates this whole externality around now teachers are confronted with how do we think about the authenticity of the information we're getting? How do we think about the educational process relative to these tools? And this is not something that there was any previous warning on before this technology just goes out, right? And so it brings up questions about what are the ways that we could think about now that this technology is there, how the educational process evolves. Now, one of the things to think about is that, in the past, there's been other ways for students to cheat. In education, oftentimes what we look at is the product that students produce, right? Write me an essay about the Civil War. And what we look at is the essay. And what we assume happened in the process is we assume that the student went and did some research and found some sources and did some reading and synthesized and wrote it all. But all we see at the end is the product. And what things like generative AI did was they said, we're going to create for you a way that you can generate product either a lot faster or entirely artificially. And really, the point for us as educators is not just to evaluate the product, it's to ensure some sort of process that's happened. And so I think one of the things we think, one of the ways we think about generative AI is how, as educators, does it get us back to thinking more about the steps in that process and how we ensure that that process is actually taking place. And it may not just be looking at the end product of writing an essay, but it may be steps along the way where we ask students, what are the 5 sources you actually came up with? What's the information you got from those 5 sources? Here's a particular argument. How do you think this source would actually respond to that argument? Or even here's a whole argument that's generated by ChatGPT. What's your rejoinder to it? And so we can engage with the technology in a way where what we're trying to do is actually get more of that process of learning that we care about, rather than just fixating on the final product, which is the thing we tend to grade and look at historically.
Well, I'm sure those students have lots of wonderful perspectives about the challenges that are faced, and the opportunities that might be there as well. Sandy adds a good question in the chat that comes back to privacy. And is the United States doing a good job protecting privacy of its citizens with regard to what's available on the internet? She writes this in the context of the frequent news stories about hacking at large companies, things like this.
So, it depends how you look at it. From my perspective, at a federal level, no, there's not enough being done to protect individual privacy. And a simple way to look at that is if you look at, for example, some of the safeguards you have in California that you don't have in the other 49 states, that makes it clear that, more regulation at a federal level is actually necessary. And these are things that are not particularly rocket science, right? They're things like the right to be able to have your data deleted from a particular platform if you don't want it there, the right to actually know what data a platform even has about you. So these are some basic rights that technologically is completely possible for these companies to provide for you. They actually, part of the reason why this legislation exists in California is that's where many of these companies are actually homed. And so the idea was if you had the legislation in California, they in some sense by default would kind of spread it to other states. But counting on that as the mechanism really is weak, right? What we really should be counting on is our lawmakers to say, here are federal level statutes that enshrine some of these particular rights that you actually should have. And so I think there's progress being made in those lines. I would like to believe that Congress can actually move on federal privacy policy. I think it's a bipartisan issue, or at least it should be, but we're not there yet.
Rory, go ahead and jump in with your comment.
Doctor, my mother was a physician, and I went bad and I went to law school, so you'll have to forgive me, but I can sort of think like a doctor. I was at a seminar recently where they were talking about developments in AI, which will affect not just the legal profession, but lots of other things. And one of our speakers was a physician who was working with some computer scientists to come up with a program that the physician would have in the office. So if you came in and you manifested these symptoms, it would give you a probable diagnosis. Okay, that's great. Well, as we all know, not everything comes out perfectly. So what happens if the physician, in all good faith, is relying on the diagnosis and it comes out bad and the patient is harmed? If this was just the doctor's decision, you'd sue the doctor would have insurance, and that would be taken care of. But if it's a flaw in the program or the hardware or something, the question that was raised, and to which I don't have an answer, and I'll probably be long dead before it's resolved, is who do you go after if there's been AIs, computer programmers, technicians who put together the programs? And that's something that before, because things will happen in medicine and elsewhere, that there needs to be some idea as to who's going to be liable. Then they can go out and buy insurance and do things like that. And we're nowhere near that stage right now. Do you have any comments on that?
It's a great question. And I think part of it gets to that notion of when you think about responsibility, in what way is the technology being embedded into a larger system? And what I mean by that is, to what extent, for example, when a doctor is making a diagnosis, is the computer really seen as a suggestive mechanism versus an authoritative mechanism? right? So is this something where the doctor should rely on, or is this really just in some sense like a second or third or fourth opinion, and the doctor ultimately has final responsibility for the decision that's made, the treatment that's given, and how it's administered? I'll give you an example that comes from the world of finance. When the decision gets made as to who gets a mortgage, oftentimes the analysis that happens is being done by computers to do things like risk profiling of someone defaulting on a mortgage, et cetera, and it makes some recommendation. There's actually a legal requirement that a human being has to be responsible for that decision. And the reason why is exactly this point, right? If something goes wrong in the sense of, say, the algorithm is discriminatory, it tends to discriminate against people of one race versus another, who do you get to sue? Because there's actually statutes around discrimination in lending. And so that's why it's not sufficient to say, well, the algorithm made the decision, so there is no one to sue, because the algorithm that lets you essentially use the algorithm as an excuse to be discriminatory. So there's a human on the hook for that decision. For medical decisions, you could say the same thing. You could say the doctor is the authoritative agent of record in the decision that gets made. Now, they can consult with different kind of AI resources as a way to help them make a better decision, but they're ultimately responsible for that decision. And that includes responsibility if there happens to be a mistake in the program or in the hardware, because the feeling is if the doctor is authoritative, if there's a recommendation that's a bad recommendation made by the system, maybe they should know better. That's one model for it. There's another model that says we pool liability. We actually say that doctors get informed by these systems, and there's a pooled liability scheme that if they're making a recommendation or a treatment based on what the program says, right, we socialize that responsibility rather than having it all privatized with the doctor. That's something as value judgment. We need to work through that process.
Last question for the recording. In the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, we are a crowd that tends to believe that technology has a positive role to play in improving the lives of people near and far, and that a careful exploration of the potential of that technology is the way to get there. You know, how do we make service innovative and sustainable is another way of looking at this particular perspective. Is there anything about more recent technologies that has given you hope that it will improve the lives of certain sets of people in certain circumstances in ways that previous technologies or circumstances would not allow?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you're ending on a positive note, because sometimes, when we talk about all these kinds of issues and problems, there's a tendency to think, oh, we have all these problems with technology. What is the real benefit? I'm a technologist. I believe there's huge benefits in technology. And I just want to mitigate some of the problems that come up. But I don't believe that that means we need to stop innovation. I think actually part of that innovation is the fact that technology can have immense positive impact on people's lives. One of them is, for example, healthcare. The notion that if we can get better understanding of how, say, different treatments lead to particular outcomes for people at an individual level, because we have more information about their particular physiology or their genome, and we can understand drug interactions better, we can understand the efficacy of different kinds of outcomes that were provided over time, we could get much better outcomes in the healthcare system. Part of that is the trade-off then that says how much of our data about our health are we willing to give up in order to collectively get better outcomes in healthcare? So these are value trade-offs. These are places where we need to be able to come together and make these kinds of decisions and understand, for me, maybe I'm willing to give up more of my data if I can get better health outcomes. That might also help other people as well. But how do we create the conduits for that kind of discussion to happen? And then how do we create the mechanisms by which that gets executed on? And so that's the place where I think when I want to think about regulation, it's not just let's think about ways to put guardrails on technology, but is also ways to be able to encode the values we care about so we can get more of the outcomes that are actually valuable to us.
Wonderfully thought-provoking. Thank you very much, Mehran. In a minute, I'll hand it back to you for the final word. But for everyone who has taken their time to watch this video, thank you for joining us in exploring the ideas and the different ways that innovative thinking and technology can come to the service of serving others. We see that as important within our club and within Rotary as a larger organization. While you are on our webpage, assuming you are so, feel free to scroll down. Let us know you were here. There's an attendance feature that allows us to kind of understand our reach better. We don't do anything sinister with that data. And then a little farther down, there is the Discuss forum where you can can see the comments our club members have made about the content, not just in this recording, but in the other parts of the meeting. The pieces that we have there about short inspirational videos and things going on in Rotary and the projects that happen with our club and our president's message and such things. So we hope you will engage with us. And if you are curious about learning more about our club, go to rotary.cool, really. So with that, I'll hand it back to Mehran. Again, thank you so much for spending your time with us. How would you like people to finish up this particular video? What thought would you like to leave them with?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me once again. Really appreciate the conversation, the insightful questions. The one thing I would leave people with is the notion of agency, to remember that, especially in Silicon Valley, there's many different roles we play. We might be engineers, we might be executives at companies, we might be people who just use the technology. But at the end of the day, we're all citizens. And to the extent that we want to see better outcomes from technology, we have this beautiful thing called democracy, which is the way that we specify our preferences and hope for better outcomes. And so I would ask everyone to inform yourselves, get engaged, and actually get involved in the decision-making process to help ensure some of the outcomes you'd like to see.
Excellent. Thank you. And everyone, we will see you next week.